Welcome to Christianity and Ethics. How is everybody today? Your first project, the one of doing a scrapbook, is one that is not going to be very hard to do if you're reading the newspapers. Every day there are several articles in every Houston newspaper which deals with ethical issues. In fact, you may need to just focus on one particular issue, one or two particular issues, because if you were to cut out all of the newspaper articles that have to do with ethical issues that we're going to discuss, that would be a pretty big book. For instance, one of the issues that is in the news almost all the time these days is the news about the environment, and another is the news about the possibility of cloning human beings. Some people thought that perhaps we would be able to head that off at the pass, and people would start passing laws against cloning human beings. But it doesn't look like that's going to happen. It looks like that, as is usually the case, if something can be done, somebody somewhere is going to do it. And so one of the things that we'll need to be focusing on in this course when we get to looking at that particular problem is not so much whether we can prevent cloning of human beings, but just discussing the ethical ramifications of cloning human beings and how we're supposed to treat the people who do this and how we're supposed to treat the people who are cloned, because there doesn't seem to be any way that we're going to be able to stop the cloning of human beings. So if we live long enough, some of us may actually meet a cloned human being. Anyway, that's the kind of thing that you can find. There was something in last week's newspaper on that, naming two people who were planning to clone human beings. So keep your eye out in the newspapers. Of course, the religion section every Saturday has something, but you'll find a number of articles before you ever get to the religion section. Okay, we're looking at our historical introduction to ethics in our book by Wagaman. And last time we were looking at various tensions within the biblical tradition. We talked about revelation versus reason. That is, that Christianity is primarily a religion of revelation. It does not derive its ideas from reason. It doesn't derive its ethics from reason, but its ideas and its ethics are considered by Christian theologians to be reasonable, obviously. And so there will be a tension between reason and revelation. And later, after the Enlightenment, a lot of people who still consider themselves to be Christians and believers in God actually critiqued and gave up the concept of revelation and assumed that they could justify belief in God completely on the basis of reason, and also to justify ethics completely on the basis of reason. We talked about the materialism versus the life of the Spirit, how that Christianity and Judaism are the most materialistic religions in the sense that they believe that matter is good, and therefore everything having to do with the created world is good. And that therefore evil and sin is something else besides something that's been created. The Bible makes it clear that everything that God created is good. Well, that means what then is evil? Well, as we're going to see, particularly when we look at Augustine, evil really doesn't have an essence. It's not a thing. Evil is something that happens in the will. That is, sin is something that happens in the will of human beings. And evil is the lack of being. It's not, evil is not something positive. And so that's the reason why Judaism and Christianity can still affirm that all things are good in themselves, that there's nothing inherently evil. That means we have to look somewhere else for a definition or a characterization of what evil is and what sin is. If you believe that matter is evil, then you really do not need a doctrine of sin. If you believe that matter is evil, then you already have your answer as to where evil comes from. But if you don't believe that matter is evil, then you have to have a doctrine of sin. That's what a lot of people do not understand these days. If you believe that matter is good, and that human life is good, and the human history is essentially good, then you must have some kind of doctrine of sin or its equivalent to try to understand what's going on then in the world. So we'll talk about that more as we go along. And then we talked about universalism versus group identity. And I told the story, we talked about the story of Jonah in that regard. A lot of people worry about the book of Jonah because the only thing they think of when they think of the book of Jonah is somebody getting swallowed by a fish. And that's not the primary point of the book of Jonah. The primary point of the book of Jonah is very important, whether or not anybody got swallowed by a fish, and that is that God is in control of the world. He's the creator of all human beings, and that therefore there's no class of human beings or race of human beings or nationality of human beings who are the only objects of God's love and concern. Then there's the tension between grace versus law. And that's true in the Hebrew Bible as well as in the New Testament, but it comes out most dramatically in the New Testament because of the New Testament story of Jesus. Because in Jesus, according to the early Christians, you have the only human being who has ever fulfilled the law. And God requires human beings to fulfill the law. Well, if God requires human beings to fulfill the law, and Jesus is the only one who has ever fulfilled the law, that is how Paul and other New Testament theologians derive the concept of being in Christ. That is, the only way we can fulfill the law is by being in Christ. That is, trusting God. Because since God is the only one who fulfills the law, He has to give us His grace, because we can't be justified by the law, even though the law is good within itself. In fact, that's the reason why we can't be justified by the law, because the law is good and we are not. That is, we are not existentially good. We are sinners. Then there's love versus force, and that's an issue that goes all the way through Christian history, as we're going to see when we look at early Christianity. And then status versus equality. That is a tension which has especially become dramatic in recent times with the crusade against slavery, the crusade for working people, economic justice, social justice, the crusade for the equality of women, and so forth. All of these are matters of status versus equality. And there has been development in the history of Christianity as to how Christian ethics deals with the social issues of any particular time. We've already indicated, for instance, that it just did not compute to anybody in the first century, even if they were Christians and they were commanded to love everybody. It did not compute that there was any way to abolish slavery, because that was simply an entrenched aspect of the existence of society all over the world. And so in that case, what Christianity did was to try to ameliorate or to change the way in which people were related to each other. In other words, there was an essential equality in the gospel, or in the story of Jesus. Jesus spent his whole life particularly his ministry, showing that human beings are all of equal value before God. But sometimes in a societal situation, how you show that equality will differ depending on the age or depending on the culture and so forth. So equality, in the sense in which we prize it in the United States, is not necessarily considered to be an absolutely essential aspect of Christian ethics. Equality in the eyes of God and equality of the indiscrimination of our love toward people is the central element of Christian ethics, and how that expresses itself in different cultures will sometimes differ. But most Christian ethicists these days assume that our present quest for equality and for social justice is the natural outcome of the history of Christian ethics. And probably in a couple of generations, we're going to look back on this generation and consider that our concept of equality is not very good, or our concept of how to treat people in certain situations is not very good. For instance, right now, and this is another ethical thing that you might look at in your newspaper. Right now, there are people all over the United States being fired, are losing their jobs, and this is kind of a stock market driven thing. In other words, in order for big companies to make sure that their bottom line is what they want it to be, in some cases the justice toward the working person kind of falls out of the equation. In the early church, there were some very radical remedies for this, and we'll talk about some of those. And there certainly was a radical remedy in the prophets of the Old Testament. Anyway, we'll talk more about status and equality. The Hebrew prophets do not appeal to an abstract principle of reality, of equality. That's what I meant by saying that our present conception of equality, to a certain extent, is an abstract principle. It's obviously not anything that we have measured up to. Even in our society, we talk about equality before the law. But you don't have to get involved in our legal system or in our justice system very long to find out that equality before the law, as an abstract principle, is an ideal that we really have not approximated to. We have very difficult problems, very severe problems in our justice system. We have severe problems in knowing how to deal with not just deal with crime, but to deal with criminals, that is, people who have been accused of committing crimes. For instance, just recently, our new governor recommended that I think it was $55 million be set aside out of the budget to provide 1,800 new prison beds. Well, an ethical thing you might ask is it possible to use $55 million to keep 1,800 people out of prison, from going to prison, by providing some kind of preventative steps, particularly having to do with addictive behavior and so forth, because so many of our people who are in prison are there because they're addicted to something. And they wouldn't be there if they weren't addicted to something. So perhaps a better use of money, ethically speaking, would be to try to keep those 1,800 people from going to prison. Now that takes work and that takes money. And as long as we just keep on building prisons, we can keep on filling them up if we don't also work on the front end. So even though we look back on the early church and on the on early efforts at Christian ethics, we have no reason to be complacent or even to have any kind of pride, because there is fragmentarily more justice in certain areas, but human beings are still having a difficult problem really giving equality before the law to our people. The Hebrew prophets, though they did not have an abstract principle of equality, they were obviously offended by existing inequalities, and especially by the difference of the rich over the plight of the poor. In fact, it's you can say that the abstract conception of equality does not live up to the prophetic conception of equality, because the prophets did not leave the rich alone. They didn't talk about the rich people being all right, but they just needed to do a little bit of work to help the poor people. From the perspective of the prophets, the fact that there were any poor people in the community, that is, any people who needed the necessities of life, meant that the rich people in the community were not just guilty of inequality or social injustice, they were guilty of idolatry, because they had pledged a covenant with a God who had a certain character. And this God was the God of the poor. He was the defender of the poor. He was the defender of widows and orphans. He was a defender of those people who got the raw end of the stick in any kind of society. Now, this was not a capitalist society, but and it had a tremendous amount of inequality. It may be that our capitalist society has kind of adjusted the extremes of inequality, but there's still a great deal of inequality in our society. And from the prophet's perspective, from the perspective of the Hebrew prophets, there is no way that Jews or Christians can be complacent about that. They can't just say, well, we just need to let the market work. If you don't let the market work, of course, you don't produce wealth. But just letting the market work without considering the social welfare of people is simply not an option for the Hebrew prophets. The Hebrews were commanded not to oppress their neighbors, and reflecting on the practical plight of the poor, wages were to be paid promptly, the very same day on which they were earned. And there were other laws that had to do with the poor. For instance, if you were a farmer and you raised crops, you were required by the law not to gather all your crops. You were required to leave some of it, so that people who, for some reason or another, were on the outs in your community could still have enough to eat. There was also the law against usury. That is, again, this is not a capitalist society, but the assumption was, by the Hebrew prophets, is that if you had money that you did not need to live on, you were under obligation. God obligated you to lend it to someone who needed it to live on, and you were under obligation to do that without taking interest. Now, that's a pretty radical social policy. It's certainly one that we don't pay much attention to anymore. So those are the tensions that we have to look for as we go through the history of Christian ethics. We need to look now at the influence of certain philosophical folks on early Christian ethics, because as Christianity moved out of Palestine into Greek thinking, Roman areas, they came in contact with certain philosophies that already had fairly systematic ethics. For instance, Plato. Plato already thought of society as containing three classes of people: the artisans, the guardians, the thinkers. And these classes correspond to the three aspects of the faculties of the human psyche: the appetitive, the spirited, and the rational. Plato, in other words, begins with society as it is and tries to explain why society is as it is. There's really not much of an impulse in Platonism or in Aristotelianism either to outlaw slavery. There may be, again, a kind of an idealistic conception of equality or an abstract conception of equality, but in the real world, people were just what they are. Truth to Plato is universal and it's eternal. The world of things is fleeting and corruptible, manifesting briefly and imperfectly the realm of pure ideas. Now that also gives you an indication that Plato did not have the same positive take on the goodness of matter and the goodness of human bodies and the goodness of human individuality and the human spirit, the human body. In Aristotle, you already had in Europe at least the ideal that human beings are by nature social and political, and they're not just isolated individuals that have gotten together. Well, this corresponds to the Hebrew and the early Christian conception of community. In fact, the word church, the best way to translate the word church is community. And so already in Aristotle then, at least the intellectuals and the ethical elites of the Roman world had a concept that ethics were primarily social. And that's true of the Hebrew prophets, that's true of early Christianity. Ethics are not just individual morality. They have to do with how you relate to other people. Aristotle also had the idea that the moral life aims at the golden mean between excess and deficiency. And all the way through history, Christians have kind of latched on to this idea to use in giving analysis to what people ought to do. Because the Bible obviously also obligates people to not be in either excess or to be deficient. Stoicism was rationalistic in its basic assumptions. Stoic thought depicted a cosmos grounded in the mind of a rational God. Human beings were understood to reflect the same rationality. Christians really like some of these ideas. The idea that some of the earlier philosophically minded Christians had was that Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, in a sense, were precursors of Christianity. In other words, from their perspective, just like the Hebrew people were precursors to Christianity, so were Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, because they kind of prepared the ground for a high view of human beings and a high view of ethics. And a lot of early Christians liked the Stoic view of God as primarily being a rational God, and human beings then being rational beings reflecting the same nature as God. This was identified with the old Hebrew Christian concept of the image of God. Now that meant that early Christians could relate to some of these philosophers in a better way because they found these correspondences. However, one of the problems in the history of Christianity is that sometimes these philosophical ideas actually overpowered some of the Christian ideas. And the Christian concept of ethics, even though it considers Christian ethics to be rational, that is, reasonable, it does not consider Christian ethics to be derived from rationality or to be derived from reason. And though for Jews and Christians human intelligence and human rationality is extremely important, it's not the most important thing about a human being. Whereas for Plato and Stoics and Aristotle, reason was one of the most important, if not the most important thing about human beings. And quite often in our own culture, our ethical relationship to people sometimes is based on their intelligence or their rationality or their education. And that is not a basis in Judaism or Christianity for being related properly to somebody. So the impact of these philosophies on Christianity has positive elements and it has negative elements. The concept of God changes as Christianity moves under the influence of Neoplatonism and Stoicism. And we'll see how that happens as we go along. Epicureanism is probably the popular philosophy of the time which least corresponds to Hebrew, Jewish, and Christian ethics. They believe that human beings are chance configurations of material particles. They did not consider life to have any enduring meaning. The best we can hope to do is enhance life's pleasures while minimizing its pains. And this ethic has never gone out of style. There are a lot of people who still basically mimic the Epicureans. Now, in general, the influence of Greek philosophy on biblical writings is quite extensive. Each of these movements was to help set the agenda for Christian ethics, as were Neoplatonism and assorted other quasi-religious philosophical movements of the Greco-Roman world. Certainly the New Testament writings themselves betray Greek philosophical sources. But I do want to make one point about that, and that is that I have a little bit of disagreement with Wagaman on the extent to which Christian ethics of the New Testament, at least, was influenced by Greek philosophical sources. In your book on page 21, did these non-biblical sources exert as much influence as the Bible? That is doubtful, but one does not want to overstate the degree to which biblical and non-biblical legacies were contradictory. I would say that you would not want to overstate the idea in which they were compatible. Nor would one want to ignore the extent to which extra-biblical resources affected the later assimilation of biblical writings. He says, at one time it was fashionable to draw a sharp contrast between Hebrew and Greek ways of thinking, associating the former with biblical writings and the latter with Greek philosophy. Not only was it at one time fashionable, but I think that still holds true. Recent Christian ethics, I think, has lost a great deal of the emphasis on the difference between Hebrew and biblical versus Greek ways of thinking. And I think it's very important to understand the New Testament, to understand that the writers of the New Testament were not Gnostics, they were not Neoplatonists, they were not Manichees. And sometimes when you overstate the emphasis of these philosophies on the New Testament, then you read Paul as if he were a Neoplatonist, or you read Paul as if he were almost a Manichee or a Gnostic. And if you really study the New Testament text, one of the things you see is that almost none of these texts would be written if it were not for the threat of Gnosticism and other kinds of non-Christian, non-biblical philosophies, because these works are written to fight the influence of these ideas. And so even though Paul wrote in Greek, and he quotes as his Bible the Greek translation of the Bible, I think it's better to assume that when Paul uses a Greek word, even when he uses a Greek word, it has been emptied somewhat of its Greek philosophical meaning, and it has inherited something of the Hebrew meaning. That's what you have to do if you translate an idea, a complex of ideas into another language. You have to use the words of the other language, but you may still keep in mind the meaning from the original language. And so Hebrew thought forms obviously had to be translated into Greek in the New Testament, because all of the New Testament was written in Greek. But, for instance, the word psyche, the Greek word for soul, means something very different when Paul uses it than it means in Plato. And so just because you find the word psyche or soul in the New Testament does not mean that you should read it as if the New Testament was written by a Platonist, because the New Testament was not written by Platonists. It was written by Hebrews. It was written by Jews. This is important, for instance, for understanding Paul's view of sexuality and Paul's view of women, because quite often people read Paul as if he were a later Christian, as if he were a Christian that had already been largely influenced by Gnosticism and by Neoplatonism. And the modern view of Paul as a kind of an anti-sex zealot or as an anti-woman zealot means that these folks are reading Paul as if he lived much later in the history of Christianity, because Paul was a Jew, and he was not converted to the kind of Gnosticism that he fought all of his life. The world of the earliest Christian centuries was framed by the Roman Empire. Many facets of ordinary life were in tension with central aspects of the faith of the earliest Christians, and it became necessary for the church to respond. So the goal of Christian ethics and what Christian ethics manages to do, at least somewhat successfully over the centuries, is to understand that if you move into Europe or if you move into other areas of the world, you're bringing something in that this part of the world did not have before. And so it would be self-defeating to simply translate without remainder the Christian faith into these other thought forms or into these other ethical systems. Because if that's what would happen, then why would you need Christianity? You already have Neoplatonism. Why would you need Gnosticism? You already have. Why would you need Christianity since you already have Gnosticism? So we need to understand that the church responds to the society and to the philosophical mindset into which it moves. And so there's influence both directions. But hopefully the influence of Christianity toward culture is transformational. That is, it's not just accommodational. In the formative years of Christianity, the main problems that had to be dealt with were the attitude toward the material world, the problem of wealth and poverty, sexual ethics, the status and the role of women, violence and the political order, the portrait of Christians in the world. We've already talked some about the attitude toward the material world. And this is a really radical view that the Hebrews, through the early Christians, are bringing into Europe, because the material world in the Roman Empire was either viewed in terms of excessive entanglement, such as in some of the sexual ethics and other kinds of things, and the disparity between wealth and poverty. While the Hebrew and the early Christian view of the material world was that we are in the world, We are part of the world, but we do not act like the world. There's a sense in which we are in the world, but we're not of the world. So there then is a more complementary conception of the relationship between ethics and the material world. In some ways, the most faithful moral issue before the earliest Christians was the question of how they should interpret and relate to the material world as such. Some of them, some voices, among them Marcion particularly, brings an almost Gnostic view of ethics to Christianity. And so what is sometimes called mainstream or orthodox or classical Christianity had to define itself as over against Marcion. Marcion believed that the Old Testament was superseded by the New Testament, and therefore the Old Testament was of no value whatever. Marcion believed that the God of the Old Testament was not the real true God, that the God of Jesus Christ was a higher God than the God of the Old Testament. So Marcion believed that matter was not good. Marcion believed that the only good thing about human beings was their spirit. So he interpreted the material world in essentially negative terms. The world in no way represents the God who is revealed through the pre-existent and risen Christ. Christ himself is to be understood in altogether spiritual terms, and faithful Christian life is to be lived entirely on that plane. You have some of this influence in the earliest church, in the time the New Testament was written. But the influence is not overwhelming of the early church. In fact, as I've indicated, the writings of the New Testament are written to a large extent to fight this influence. Later Gnostic Gospels and later writings by Gnostics and Marcionites and some of these other folks almost completely overwhelmed the Christian tradition that they got from the Jews, that the world was good, and that matter was good, and that sexuality was good. So that was one of the issues then that had to be fought out in the early church. And when the fight was over, these anti-material views, hyper-spiritual views, had a great deal remaining, a great deal left over, as we're going to see when we look at Augustine. But even Augustine is not purely a Neoplatonist, and he's certainly not a Gnostic, and he's certainly not a Manichae, but you see some of these influences in Augustine. Augustine was trying to be a biblical theologian, and so that enabled Augustine to avoid the excesses of the Gnostics and the Neoplatonists. But he still was hanging on to a number of things which influenced considerably the later history of Christianity. As far as wealth and poverty was concerned, the early church took seriously the prophetic understanding of this inequality between wealth and poverty. They underscored that the importance of the material world to God's purpose and human well-being by giving enormous attention to the relationship between rich and poor. The purpose of the prophets is not to get rid of wealth. It's not to get rid of rich people. The purpose of early New Testament ethics was not to get rid of wealth. It was to try to influence the relationship between the Christian and wealth, the relationship between the poor and the rich. And there are several ways in the New Testament in which this relationship is changed. In the earliest church, in the church at Jerusalem, there was even an attempt at what they would call communism with a small c. That is, after the first Jews became Christian in about AD 30, after the death of Christ, it says in the book of Acts that they held all things in common. They sold everything they had and put it into a central cache, and then people needed what people needed, they were able to get. In other words, they kind of set loose to their wealth. But they didn't approach wealth like some later monks did, who were more influenced by Gnosticism and by Neoplatonism and other forms of philosophy. They didn't consider wealth within itself to be evil. They believed, in fact, that wealth was good, that it was an expression of the creation of God. And the problem was not that you should get rid of all your wealth. The problem is that you should share it. In other words, God wanted people to appreciate and to enjoy the wealth that the world provides. The wealth that the world provides is an expression of God's loving care. It's an expression of His creation. Even money is not considered evil in the New Testament, though a lot of people think it is. A lot of people think there's a verse in the New Testament that says money is the root of all evil. There is no such verse in the New Testament. There is a verse in the New Testament that says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And when Jesus talks to rich people, He's talking about the problem they're going to have being rich, not because riches themselves are evil, but because if you are rich, then you have the temptation, and a very strong temptation, to be improperly related to riches. And if you're improperly related to riches, then you'll be improperly related to your fellow human beings as well. Because improper relationship to riches from the New Testament perspective is idolatry. Having wealth is not idolatry, but being improperly related to it is idolatry. And of course, conspicuous consumption and hoarding and greed are ways in which you can be improperly related to wealth. And also refusal to consider the needs of the poor, refusing to consider the problems in distribution of the good things of God's creation are very important for the early Christians. Poverty is a plight to which faithful Christians, especially those with wealth, must respond. The spiritual danger of wealth is partly in its temptation toward idolatry, thus substituting worship of material things for the worship of God. Now, we need to talk about idolatry because that in the biblical perspective is another way of talking about sin. Idolatry is the most prevalent way in which the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible talks about sin. So sin is not just a kind of an individual deficiency. Sin, from the biblical perspective, is idolatry. How can you tell whether you're an idolater or not? Well, one of the ways the prophets can tell if you're an idolater is if you don't take care of the poor. If you don't take care of the poor, that means that the God that you're worshiping is not the God of the Bible. It's not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's not the God of Moses. It's not the God of the prophets. If you misuse other people, and if you're not concerned about the poor in your community, then you're an idolater. So the basic sin that the prophets cry out against is idolatry. Jesus himself, of course, just like all other human beings, used money. In fact, most of the money he used in his 3 years of ministry came from some wealthy women who were his disciples. You know, there's a difference between disciples and apostles, and evidently a great deal of the expenses that Jesus had in his earthly ministry were taken care of by wealthy women who followed him. And so he had nothing specifically to say about wealth as being evil like later monks would. in fact, the idea of a Jewish monk is kind of a non sequitur. There's no such thing as a Jewish monk if a Jew understands the biblical doctrine of creation. Money simply represents creation. So there's nothing evil about money. But there is something evil about people hoarding money and considering money actually to be a sign of righteousness, and considering inequality to be the will of God. Inequality is never the will of God. So whatever, from the perspective of the prophets, whatever people can do to try to alleviate that is required by the law. Now that didn't mean they were socialists or communists. That's a later invention. But socialism and communism actually arose in Western culture in response to the fact that the church, that is, that Christians, were not taking seriously social ethics. We're not taking seriously the responsibility to the poor, and assuming that poor people were made poor by God on purpose, and that Christians who were really Christians and were really holy would also become poor. The many exhortations to give to the poor contained in the writings of the first 2 centuries suggest individual acts of charity rather than institutional schemes for sharing as the dominant pattern. Despite the early Christian stress on the perils of wealth and the importance of sharing with those in need, these writings very seldom question or venture any criticism of slavery. Sexual ethics, of course, is when most people think of ethics, they almost always think of sex, as if sexual ethics were the only kind of ethics. Well, this was certainly a problem for the early church because of the promiscuous kind of sexual morality which was characteristic of the Roman Empire. Early Christian writings advocate, even command, very strict standards. One of the early writers says that Christians share their board, but not their beds, not their marriage beds. And this is very important in the history, by the way, of women's equality. A lot of people don't understand that Jesus' sayings about adultery and about marriage and divorce and so forth are not meant just to cramp people's style. They're meant actually to elevate the status of women. And the kind of promiscuity that went on in the Roman Empire, women were simply sex objects. And so the early church offered marriage and commitment to marriage, a marriage that is characterized, as Paul said, by a man loving his wife as Christ loved the church. An absolute commitment to that marriage they put over against the kind of misuse of women that existed in the Roman Empire. So following in the wake of Paul's writings on the subject and often quoting them directly, the surviving instruction insists upon the correlation between spiritual wholeness and sexual discipline. The communists of the Soviet Union, at first, many of them operated under what they called the glass of water view of sex, and that is that sex is just like drinking a glass of water. It doesn't make any difference which glass you drink from. Viewing sexuality as primarily simply an animal or a mechanical function of human beings. Whereas, and they soon learned that was not a very healthy way. Even the communists learned that was not a very healthy way of dealing with sexuality. And so there was a reaction in the Soviet Union back to a very strict sexual ethic. When Khrushchev came to the United States, he was incensed when some Americans took him to see the filming of a motion picture in which there were dancing girls. So here was this hard-nosed communist who thought that American sexual ethics were too loose and too promiscuous. And the reason why I bring up that subject is that the Soviet Union tried to develop a sexual ethic that was totally secular and had nothing to do with spiritual values. And that's the way it was in the early Roman Empire, and the Christians reacted against that by saying that sexual relationship is a spiritual activity, not just a physical activity. And a proper sexual relationship actually produced spiritual wholeness, whereas promiscuity and improper relationships were defeating. They were self-defeating. They really didn't produce the kind of life and wholeness that people wanted. So there was an emphasis on sexual discipline in the early church. Sexual relations between persons of the same gender, while not as major a preoccupation of these writings as lust, fornication, and adultery, are also condemned. Polycarp quotes Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 6, "Neither fornicators, nor the effeminate, nor homosexuals will inherit the kingdom of God." And that's something that simply can't be erased from the ethic of the early church. On the other hand, we can understand a little bit about the cultural context in which these statements are made. For one thing, Paul, nor anybody else, gives any indication that they are aware of what we today call homosexuality. Most of the homosexual activity that Paul had anything to do with, interestingly enough, was activity between heterosexuals. For instance, it was homosexual activity that was involved in pagan worship, or it was homosexual activity that was recommended by the army, or it was homosexuality that was recommended by philosophers. So if you're going back to this period of time, even before the period of Christ, with Plato and Socrates and people like that, you can't know from the kind of sexual activity these people are involved in whether they are homosexuals in the modern sense. They may be cultural homosexuals or even philosophical homosexuals. For instance, homosexuality was encouraged in the Roman army for very practical reasons. That was, they didn't like camp followers or prostitutes following armies all over the world. Homosexuality was promoted among Greek soldiers sometimes. And so what you have in ancient society is more of a gender-bending kind of thing that was recommended for practical and sometimes even philosophical reasons. For instance, if your conception of women was very low, then that meant sex with women was of a lower class. And ironically, a great many people recommended that if a man is going to have sex, he ought to have it with another man who is a higher being. And so there are all kinds of different ways in which sexuality had developed in the Roman Empire that struck the early Christians, since they were Hebrews, and considered sexuality to be a good thing that was created by God, primarily for procreation, but also for fellowship between a man and a woman. And the kind of sexuality that was practiced by lots of people in the Roman Empire had nothing to do with fellowship between men and women. It had nothing to do, in fact, with procreation. It was just activity based on other ethical bases. And so that's one thing that has been brought out by modern study, is that most homosexuality that Paul and the early Christians were dealing with was homosexual activity by heterosexuals. And that's an interesting difference between the early church and the modern situation. Another problem that they had to deal with was the status and role of women. So far as the status relationships of men and women are concerned, the early church was generally male-dominated. The Hebrews, the Jews, were fairly male-dominated. That does not mean that I don't think that means that the early Christians had the same understanding of the value of females that some of the pagan philosophers had. A number of the pagan philosophers believed that women had less soul than males. Well, there was what we today would consider a kind of discrimination and oppression of women by biblical people. But it was not on the basis, I don't think, that women are not also made in the image of God, or that women have less soul than men do. It was generally simply the fact of the cultural development of the relationship between men and women, and so the ethics of the relationship between men and women in the New Testament is very different even from the relationship of men and women in the Old Testament because of the experience of Jesus. Jesus had a very different relationship to women in his ministry than was considered even proper by the culture, by the Jewish culture. He spoke to them on the street. He actually treated them as if they were equals. That was one of the things that caused Jesus a great deal of problem. Not only did he treat ordinary women as equals, but he even treated prostitutes as equals. So you could not come out of the life of Jesus and the activity and the teaching of Jesus and have exactly the same ideas or attitudes toward the relationship between men and women. For instance, in the Old Testament, women, the primary role of women was not to participate in public worship. That was the role of men. That didn't necessarily mean that the Jews thought that the women were not valuable enough to worship God, because women obviously worship God even though they didn't participate in public worship. But the idea seems to be that women had important things to do, and that the male was kind of the high priest of the family, or the representative of the family before God. So there's no denying that women were treated in a way that even Christians and Jews today would consider to be inferior. But the general underlying superiority of men to women is conveyed on a more routine basis in all of these writings by habitual use of male metaphors and pronouns, speaking of God, Father, Him, and so forth. Still, it is a mistake to think of this literature on the whole as dehumanizing women. Women are frequently addressed as responsible, thinking, moral beings, quite capable of responding in faith and service to God's love. Another problem that the early church had to deal with was the relationship between violence and the political order. Some historians of the period have commented that the early church was essentially pacifist during the first 2 centuries. There would have been no possible way of Christians having much impact on how government operated when Christianity first began. And so in a sense, Christians were considered to be kind of aliens in their own country, wherever they were. But that didn't mean that they were not good citizens. The New Testament makes clear that in order for Christians to accomplish what they're supposed to do in the world, they're supposed to be good citizens. They're supposed to pray and honor the emperor. And if you know the character of some of the emperors that Christians were required to pray for, you would wonder how they could do it. But they were considered under obligation to obey the emperor and to obey authorities insofar as obeying those authorities was consistent with their Christian witness or their Christian message. In terms of violence, Roland Bainton distinguishes three basic Christian positions on war. One, pacifism, which rejects war altogether, and there have always been complete pacifists throughout the history of Christianity, and there are still Christian pacifists. But then what developed after the period of the earliest history of Christianity, and this was developed largely by people like Augustine, was the idea that there could be a just war as long as the circumstances were prescribed very carefully, under which war can be regarded as justified. Even a person like Augustine believed in absolute pacifism in terms of individual relationships, based on Jesus' statement that if somebody strikes you on one cheek, you should turn the other cheek. Augustine believed that that's the way individuals ought to be related to people. In other words, there's no justification at all for individual violence against another individual, or even a violent response to violence just from another individual. But there is the possibility, Augustine decided, for a Christian to actually participate in violence if it was for the protection of others. In other words, the idea developed that a just war could be an expression of Christian love. Now, Christian pacifists have always considered that to be a cop-out and a compromise. But at least if you're going to understand the history of Christianity and why Christians in the early centuries were pacifist and most Christians today are not pacifist, you have to understand the development of this concept of the just war. And this concept has been used considerably in the last couple of centuries in America, because the American Revolutionary War was obviously considered to be a just war by the Christians that participated in it, because most of the people who participated in it on both sides considered themselves to be Christians. The Civil War was considered to be a just war by both sides. Obviously their justification was different on each side. And World War I was considered to be a just war. All of the wars we've ever fought were considered to be just war by some Christians. But we also need to understand that all of the wars we've ever fought have also been considered to be unjust wars by many Christians. The one war in which most Christians came to the conclusion, almost all Christians came to the conclusion was a just war, was World War II. You had a tremendous amount of opposition from some Christians to all of the other wars that the United States has participated in. And of course, the greatest opposition that came from Christian sources, both pacifist and just war theorists, was to the Vietnam War. But then there's a third way in which Christians have related to war, and that's the Crusade, which glorifies warfare waged against the enemies of God. And that is, the Crusade is not really justified by any important Christian theologians. It's obviously a kind of war that Christians participated in, or people who call themselves Christians. But just the way these crusades were carried on showed that there was not really much of an ethical basis for them in Christianity. The more serious and difficult question is whether Christians considered the coercive power of the state to be morally legitimate. And the earliest Christians who write in the New Testament, have come to terms with the coercive power of the state. In other words, from the time when Jesus given a coin and asked, Jesus was asked whether you should honor Caesar or not. And Jesus took a coin and asked, well, whose picture is on this coin? And the picture was Caesar. He said, give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and give to God that which is God's. So already Jesus left the impression that a person could not live in the world without having a positive relationship with governmental authority. But Christians should also live in the world, in a sense, in tension with governmental authority. Paul had a fairly positive view toward governmental authority because he was a Roman citizen, and he received quite a few benefits from being a Roman citizen, including the fact that Roman police rescued him from being assassinated when he went to Jerusalem. And he appealed to Roman law and got a free trip to Rome. Of course, after he got there, he probably didn't like what happened to him. But Paul, in his writings, say that the Roman government, the emperor, is a servant of God. Now, it's hard for modern people to think of Nero as a servant of God. But Paul didn't mean Nero was a servant of God in the sense that he was a good man. The concept of the king being the servant of God goes all the way back to the Old Testament, and sometimes some very evil people were called servants of God, not because they were good people, but because they did God's bidding in certain situations. And from Paul's perspective, when a Roman emperor executes the law, he is upholding justice, even though obviously the justice of the Roman government would not be considered very just from the modern perspective. If you consider Roman law in the perspective of the history of the world up until that time, the Roman government was a comparatively just society, at least for some people. So the Roman government provided peace, it provided the police protection, it provided roads, it provided all kinds of things that people assumed, even early Christians assumed, was the work of God. And so Paul and the writer of 1 Peter and other writers in the New Testament assumed that a Christian is not going to be involved in any revolutionary activity. He's going to be doing what he is supposed to do in his relationship to his family and relationship to other people. And he was supposed to obey the police and obey the law to whatever extent he could. In fact, about the only place where Christians stopped obeying the law was when the law required them, for instance, to perform some idolatrous act or forbade them to spread their faith. Other than that, they assumed that, in fact, Paul uses the expression that the emperor does not bear the sword in vain. That means that murderers, even if they're Christians, should understand that they owe their lives to the Roman emperor if they commit murder, and if they commit any other criminal act. Then the Roman emperor, no matter how illegitimate he might be in terms of his personal morality, is legitimate in the sense that he is a servant of God. First Clement, for instance, has a prayer, and he's one of the earlier writers in the Christian church outside of the New Testament. And his prayer says, "You, Master," that is Christ, "gave them," that is the rulers, "imperial power through your majesty and indescribable might, so that we, recognizing it was you who gave them the glory and the honor, might submit to them, and in no way oppose your will. Grant them, O Lord, health, peace, harmony, and stability, so that they may give no offense in administering the government you have given them. For it is you, Master, the heavenly King of eternity, who gives the sons of men glory and honor and authority over the earth's people. So there was no problem in the early church of recognizing the authority of government. In fact, later, when a great many governmental officials became Christians, the opposite problem came to the fore, and that is that sometimes Christians were required to submit to authority which they considered to be unchristian, even though it was operated by Christians. So obviously Christians regarded the periodic waves of persecution as an outrage. But to the extent the state set itself against the church, it set itself against God. But in ordinary circumstances, Christians considered themselves to be good citizens. Now, as far as the portrait of Christians in the world during the early centuries, fateful controversies over the fundamental attitude of that Christians should have toward the world were fought, with echoes destined to affect the whole later development of the church. Nor could all of the specific teachings of the early church still be viewed as morally sensitive and insightful. When we do ethics these days, for instance, we assume that our opposition to slavery is a part of the revelation of God, even though it may be belated in the sense of people recognizing the importance of the abolition of slavery. And so there are some things about early Christian ethics that we consider to be insensitive. But there are also things about early Christian ethics which are light years ahead of us in the way that we relate to other people. It's sometimes argued that the early Christians captivated people by upholding high moral standards. Admittedly, their standards were in vivid contrast with the decadence of so much of the surrounding culture. But this contrast must have impressed many people. But probably what impressed people more than the moral strictures of early Christians was their ethic of love. One wonders whether beyond the negative moral commandments that abound in the literature of the period, the magnetism of the life of love may not have constituted a deeper appeal. It's sometimes argued that the early Christians captivated people by upholding high moral values. I'm going the wrong way. The paradoxical witness of that life is expressed with unusual power in the anonymous letter to Diognetus, written, we think, in the latter part of the 2nd century. He says that Christians cannot be distinguished from the rest of the human race in ordinary terms by country or language or customs, and that they do not live in cities of their own or use a peculiar form of speech or follow an eccentric manner of life. But the writer of this letter claims that Christians give proof of the remarkable and admittedly extraordinary constitution of their own commonwealth. And he further says, and this is quoting from page 36 of your book, they live in their own countries, but only as aliens. They have a share in everything as citizens and endure everything as foreigners. Every foreign land is their native land, and yet for them every native land is a foreign land. They marry like everyone else. They beget offspring, but they do not cast out their offspring. That was a very important difference between Christians and the surrounding culture. The Romans at the time of early Christianity did not have to depend on abortion or any other kind of contraceptive, because if they had a child born that they didn't want, they just threw it out. And so this was a very important distinction that Christians made between themselves and the surrounding culture. That is, when they had children, they kept their children as gifts from God. They share their board with each other, but not their marriage bed. It is true that they are in the flesh, but they do not live according to the flesh. They busy themselves on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. They obey the established laws, but in their own lives they go far beyond what the laws require. They love everyone, and by everyone they are persecuted. To put it simply, he says, what the soul is in the body, that Christians are in the world. The soul is shut up in the body, and yet itself holds the body together. While Christians are restrained in the world as in a prison, yet themselves hold the world together. So they had a very high understanding of their role in the world, and we'll talk about that some more next time.